September 1943. Winston Churchill stood on the floor of the Boeing facility in Seattle, observing the assembly line stretching endlessly before him. B-17, flying fortresses in various phases of construction, occupied the vast space. Workers, like industrious ants on a mound, swarmed over each aircraft. The Prime Minister had witnessed British factories and toured domestic aircraft plants, producing Spitfires and Lancasters under the perpetual threat of German aerial assaults. However, this was an entirely different magnitude of operation. He turned to his aide, his voice resonating with a genuine sense of awe. "American wartime manufacturing," he declared, "is not merely a marvel, it is a miraculous achievement." Churchill had been vocal about America's industrial prowess since 1941, when President Roosevelt pledged to transform the United States into the arsenal of democracy. Yet, pronouncements and personal observation are disparate experiences. Standing in that Boeing plant, witnessing a new bomber materialize every few hours, the abstract transformed into the tangible. Britain had endured years of solitary combat, conserving every resource, meticulously rationing even the smallest necessities. And here, a single American facility was churning out heavy bombers at a rate that would have seemed utterly fantastical in London. The figures were almost beyond comprehension. Boeing would ultimately manufacture nearly 13,000 B-70 bombers before the conflict's conclusion. Yet that represented only one model from one corporation. Consolidated was constructing B-24s, and Douglas was producing transport aircraft in large quantities. North American Aviation operated a plant in California that, at its zenith, assembled one B-25 Mitchell bomber every 60 minutes. 60 minutes. A complete medium bomber from inception to completion in the time it takes to enjoy a midday meal. Churchill had arrived in Washington in May 1943 for the Trident Conference, where Allied strategies for the invasion of Europe were being formulated. However, between formal sessions, he had expressed a desire to inspect American production capabilities, not merely as a courtesy, but as a genuine necessity. He needed to witness it himself, to comprehend the tangible implications of Britain's alliance with America. At the Willow Run plant, situated outside Detroit, Ford was assembling B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line that spanned 1 mile in length. Henry Ford had adapted automotive production methodologies to aircraft manufacturing, resulting in a structure so immense that it possessed its own internal meteorological system. Cumulus clouds would form near the ceiling on particularly humid days. Churchill traversed the entire length of that assembly line, observing partially constructed bombers being moved from one workstation to another, with laborers meticulously adding components with practiced efficiency. "This is mass production elevated to the status of an art," he conveyed to the plant managers. Then, in a softer tone, he added a sentiment that his aide later meticulously recorded in his diary. "Thank Providence that they are on our side this time." That final phrase carried profound weight. Churchill, a young man during the First World War and a cabinet member, had witnessed the repercussions of America's late entry into that conflict. This time, American industry had been granted 2 years to build momentum prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and an additional year and a half since then to reach its full operational capacity. The outcomes were astonishing. Nevertheless, Churchill's reaction, despite his evident admiration, remained subtly tempered by British reserve and astute political calculation. He was a grateful ally, yet acutely aware of the political ramifications of America's burgeoning dominance. The Soviet response presented an entirely different dynamic. Anastas Mikoyan arrived in the United States in 1942 as Stalin's appointed representative to oversee Lend-Lease arrangements. He held the title of People's Commissar for Foreign Trade, a role that entailed ensuring the Soviet Union received all necessary provisions from American manufacturing. He anticipated arduous negotiations, a struggle for every tank and truck. What he encountered, however, left him struggling to fully process the sheer scale of what he was witnessing. At the Ford River Rouge complex in Michigan, Mikoyan observed the integrated steel production operation. Iron ore entered at one end, and finished automobiles and tanks emerged from the other. The facility employed 90,000 workers and operated continuously around the clock. Mikoyan had previously toured Soviet factories, had overseen the desperate relocation of industrial equipment ahead of the German advance, and had witnessed the extraordinary efforts to reconstitute production beyond the Ural Mountains. He understood the significance of industrial capacity, the intricacies of factories and output. But this was different. The scale was incomparable. The efficiency was unparalleled. Everything was different. "We possess nothing of this magnitude," he confided to his translator, observing a new truck roll off the production line every 2 minutes. Nothing even remotely close. The translator paused, uncertain whether this observation was intended for official documentation or was a personal reflection. Mikoyan noticed the hesitation and let out a laugh, devoid of any mirth. "Record it," he instructed. "It is the absolute truth. Stalin must be apprised of the truth." What Stalin was aware of, or chose to acknowledge, was a complex matter. Publicly, Soviet propaganda lauded Soviet production, sacrifice, and eventual victory. However, in private correspondence, Stalin did acknowledge the critical importance of American assistance. In a communication to Roosevelt, he characterized the American production support as invaluable. Later, during a dinner toast in Tehran, he was even more direct. "Without American production," he stated, raising his glass to Roosevelt, "the United Nations could never have achieved victory in this war." It was Nikita Khrushchev, years after the war's end, who articulated with the greatest candor the true sentiments of Soviet leadership. In his memoirs, he described the reaction among Soviet officials to the deliveries of American Lend-Lease supplies. "Just imagine," he wrote, "how we would have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin without them. Our losses would have been catastrophic, as we would have lacked the necessary maneuverability." He then added a particularly revealing detail. "Stalin never officially stated this, but I heard him say it privately. He remarked that if we had been compelled to confront Nazi Germany on our own, we would have been defeated." This account was penned years after Stalin's passing, when Khrushchev could speak with greater freedom. Nevertheless, the sentiment accurately reflected what Soviet leaders had perceived and understood during the war itself. American production was not merely beneficial, it was a decisive factor. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most decorated military commander, offered an even more specific assessment in his post-war recollections. "When we entered Berlin," he stated, "we were traveling in American trucks, consuming American provisions, and utilizing American radio equipment. We could not have achieved victory without American production." The statistical data underpinning these reactions was truly staggering. The United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. 300,000. Germany manufactured roughly 119,000, and Japan 76,000. The United States alone produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined, and then added another 100,000 on top of that total. Tanks told a similar narrative. America constructed 88,000 tanks. Britain built 28,000. The Soviet Union, despite fighting on its own soil with its industrial infrastructure partially in ruins, managed to produce over 100,000 tanks through sheer, desperate effort. Germany, however, the formidable military power that had subjugated much of Europe, produced a mere 46,000 tanks throughout the entire conflict. And ships, the vessels of the sea, presented perhaps the most dramatic illustration of all. Henry Kaiser had never engaged in shipbuilding prior to the war. He was a renowned construction magnate, celebrated for his achievements in building dams and highways. But as the war commenced, and America urgently required cargo ships, Kaiser applied construction methodologies to shipbuilding. He established shipyards on the West Coast and initiated the production of Liberty ships, the cargo vessels destined to transport supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. Traditional shipbuilding typically took many months. Kaiser's shipyards, at their peak operational efficiency, could construct a Liberty ship in an average of 42 days. 42 days from the laying of the keel to the launching of a completed cargo vessel. But that was merely the average. To demonstrate the extraordinary potential, Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 completed the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in a remarkable 4 days and 15.5 hours from keel laying to launch. 4 days. A complete ocean-going cargo ship in just 4 days. Upon hearing of these feats, many British shipbuilders dismissed the reports as propaganda, assuming the figures must be inflated. Subsequently, British observers traveled to witness firsthand and confirmed the astonishing reality. They observed the assembly of prefabricated sections, the coordinated efforts of welding crews, and the construction of a ship at a pace that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. One British naval officer, witnessing a Liberty ship launch at a Kaiser shipyard, turned to his American escort and posed a simple yet profound question. "How many of these can you build? How many do you require?" The American replied. This was not a boast, but a genuine inquiry. American shipyards would ultimately produce 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. 2,700 cargo vessels, in addition to hundreds of other ship types, ranging from aircraft carriers and destroyers to landing craft. The United States constructed more ships during the Second World War than all other nations combined had built in the preceding century. This was the manufacturing capacity that elicited such profound reactions from Allied leaders. It was not derived from abstract figures in reports, but from a tangible reality they could personally observe and interact with. Factories extending for miles, assembly lines operating ceaselessly, ships gliding down slipways into the water one after another, filling harbors to such an extent that new ones had to be established. Charles de Gaulle visited the United States in July 1944, shortly after the liberation of Paris. As the leader of Free France, he represented a nation that had endured conquest, occupation, and profound humiliation. He journeyed to Washington to assert French dignity and sovereignty, to emphatically convey that France remained a great power and merited such treatment. Yet even de Gaulle, with all his pride and unwavering resolve to restore French prestige, could not entirely conceal his astonishment at American production capabilities. Following his tours of several manufacturing facilities, he penned his memoirs, detailing the extraordinary American capacity for industrial output. He noted that France would need to reconstitute its industrial base post-war, and that we have much to learn from American methods. This sentiment came from de Gaulle, a figure who typically emphasized France's self-sufficiency and independence from external influence. The Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, exhibited a more direct response. Australia had faced a direct threat of Japanese invasion, having witnessed the fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin. When American forces and supplies began arriving in Australia in 1942, Curtin immediately grasped that American production represented the sole bulwark standing between Australia and Japanese occupation. "Without America," he declared in a radio address, "Australia cannot survive." It was a blunt assertion, and it proved politically costly for him among those who advocated maintaining strong ties with Britain. However, Curtin had seen the numbers, had observed the American vessels arriving laden with troops and equipment, and had comprehended the undeniable mathematical reality of the situation. Britain, preoccupied with conflicts in Europe and North Africa, could not effectively defend Australia. Only American production could furnish the necessary forces to secure the Pacific theater. Perhaps the most revealing reaction, however, emanated not from a preeminent Allied leader, but from a German officer captured after the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. During his interrogation, he was presented with photographic evidence of American production facilities. After studying them intently, he inquired whether they represented genuine capabilities or mere propaganda. "They are real," the interrogator confirmed. The German officer remained silent for a moment, then uttered a statement that the interrogator duly recorded in his report. "Then we have already lost. We lost the moment America entered the war. We simply were not yet aware of it." This was the reality that Allied leaders had begun to comprehend much earlier, when Churchill stood within that Seattle Boeing plant, when Mikoyan traversed the Ford River Rouge complex, and when Soviet officials witnessed the convoys of American trucks arriving via the Murmansk route. They understood a fundamental truth about the war. Industrial capacity would be the decisive element. The side capable of producing more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more ammunition, and more of everything else would ultimately prevail. And America possessed the capacity to produce more of everything than all other nations combined. The numbers were almost unfathomable. America manufactured 2.6 million trucks during the war, while Germany produced only 345,000. The Soviet Union, engaged in a desperate struggle on its own territory, produced 265,000 trucks. America dispatched 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease and still retained over 2 million for its own use. America produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition. 41 billion. This equated to more than 500 rounds for every individual on Earth at that time. America produced 2 million tons of steel each month at the peak of its production capabilities. Each month. This figure exceeded Germany's total annual steel output prior to the war. These were not merely statistics. They were tangible manifestations of an industrial capacity never before witnessed by the world. And Allied leaders, upon experiencing this capacity firsthand, immediately grasped its profound implications for the war's eventual outcome. Lord Beaverbrook, Britain's Minister of Aircraft Production, visited the United States in 1941 to coordinate aircraft production and procurement. He was a formidable figure, a newspaper magnate who had amassed an empire through astute and often ruthless business practices. He was not prone to sentimentality or exaggeration. After touring American aircraft plants, he transmitted a starkly honest message back to Churchill. "The scale of American production is beyond anything we imagined," he wrote. "Our own efforts, which we considered impressive, are revealed as modest in comparison. If America applies even half of this capacity to war production, the Axis powers cannot possibly win." This was in 1941, preceding Pearl Harbor, and before America had fully mobilized its resources. Beaverbrook was observing American industry in its nascent stages of expansion, in the process of transitioning from civilian to military manufacturing, and still refining its techniques for efficient weapons production. And even this early iteration of American war production impressed him to such an extent that he declared the war's outcome to be inevitable. He was, of course, correct, but the certainty of that outcome was not universally evident at the time. In 1941, Germany controlled the majority of Europe, Japan dominated a significant portion of Asia, and the Soviet Union was reeling from the German invasion. Britain was surviving, albeit precariously, reliant on convoys that were being relentlessly attacked by U-boats. The war's conclusion was far from assured. What Beaverbrook observed, what Churchill witnessed, and what Mikoyan experienced was the crucial factor that would ultimately tip the scales. Not instantaneously, nor miraculously, but inevitably, American production would wear down the Axis powers through sheer material superiority. There would still be arduous fighting, horrific casualties, and desperate moments. But the mathematical probabilities were clear. The side possessing more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, and more ammunition would emerge victorious, and America possessed more of everything. Stalin understood this, even as he publicly emphasized Soviet production and sacrifice. In a 1943 letter to Roosevelt, he articulated his views on American production in terms that were unusually direct for him. The United States has demonstrated its capacity to produce armaments in maximum quantities, he wrote. This is a factor of paramount importance for the defeat of our common enemy. Coming from Stalin, a leader who rarely offered praise to anyone, this was remarkable. He was acknowledging that Soviet victory was contingent upon American production, not merely aided by it, but fundamentally dependent upon it. The Soviet Union received under Lend-Lease 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 15 million pairs of boots, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and raw materials. Without these essential supplies, Soviet armies would have been unable to sustain their offensives from Stalingrad to Berlin. They would have exhausted their supply of trucks, run out of fuel, and depleted their food reserves. The soldiers would have been without footwear, and the tanks would have been without diesel fuel. Zhukov's post-war statement about entering Berlin in American trucks was not a poetic embellishment. It was a literal truth. Soviet mechanized units utilized American trucks because Soviet truck production could not meet the demands of mobile warfare. Soviet soldiers consumed American canned goods because Soviet agriculture had been devastated by German occupation. Soviet armies communicated using American radio equipment because American radio production far surpassed Soviet capacity. This was what Allied leaders observed when they witnessed American production firsthand. Not merely impressive factories or ingenious techniques, but the tangible manifestation of an industrial capacity that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. When Churchill delivered his famous "Give us the tools and we will finish the job" speech in February 1941, he was appealing to America for assistance. When he toured American factories in 1943, he understood that America had provided Britain with far more than mere tools. America had furnished the Allies with the industrial foundation necessary for victory. His reaction, standing in that Boeing plant and observing bombers taking shape, was not simply political rhetoric. It was a genuine recognition of what he was witnessing. The miracle he referenced was not supernatural, it was industrial. The miracle lay in a nation's ability to completely transform its economy with unprecedented speed and produce armaments on a scale that rendered victory inevitable. Other Allied leaders experienced similar moments of profound realization, the instant when abstract knowledge coalesced into concrete reality, the moment when they understood, not just intellectually, but viscerally, the implications of American production. The moment they knew with absolute certainty that the war would be won. That certainty arrived at different junctures for different leaders. For Churchill, it arrived with America's entry into the war in December 1941. He later recounted going to bed that night and sleeping the sleep of the saved and thankful. However, witnessing American production firsthand solidified what he had hoped for. America was not merely participating in the war. America possessed the capacity to win it. For Soviet leaders, the certainty dawned more gradually. Stalin harbored deep suspicions of everyone, including his allies. He persistently demanded the establishment of a second front in Europe, accusing the British and Americans of deliberate delays intended to allow the Soviets to bleed themselves dry. Yet even Stalin could not deny the impact of American production on Soviet military operations. The trucks continued to arrive, the tanks kept coming, and the provisions kept flowing. And the Soviet armies pressed onward. For smaller Allied nations, certainty emerged from straightforward mathematical calculations. They could not defeat the Axis powers alone. Britain could not achieve victory independently. The Soviet Union, despite its vast territory and immense population, could not triumph in isolation. But collectively, sustained by American production, the Allies possessed the means to grind down the Axis through overwhelming material superiority. This was the underlying message in the reactions of Allied leaders upon witnessing American production firsthand. It was not merely an expression of admiration for American ingenuity or efficiency, but a profound recognition that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies would prevail because America could produce more weaponry than the Axis could destroy, more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could shoot down, more ships than the U-boats could sink, and more tanks than the Wehrmacht could incapacitate. The German officer who stated, "We lost the moment America entered the war," comprehended this fundamental truth. So too did the Allied leaders. The instant they witnessed American production firsthand, they knew, not merely hoped or believed, but knew with absolute certainty that the Allies would win, because industrial capacity would prove decisive. And America's industrial capacity was overwhelmingly superior. This was the essence of what Allied leaders conveyed when they first observed American wartime production. Perhaps not articulated in precisely these words, but inherent in every reaction, every quotation, and every observation, the message remained consistent. This alters everything. This secures victory. This is the decisive factor that transforms Churchill's observation into a miracle. Mikoyan's stunned acknowledgement of the Soviet Union's comparative lack of such capabilities, Stalin's private admission that the Soviets could not have achieved victory unilaterally, Zhukov's stark pronouncement about entering Berlin in American trucks, Beaverbrook's declaration that the Axis powers were destined to lose. These were not mere compliments. They represented a profound understanding of a fundamental principle of modern warfare. The sheer scale of manufacturing power proved to be the pivotal element, and America's ability to produce goods on an unmatched level in recorded human existence was the key. This was the realization that dawned upon the leaders of the Allied nations. This was the understanding that took hold. This is what they articulated in their own distinct styles upon their initial exposure to the might of American wartime manufacturing. The manufacturing hubs that so profoundly astonished them would sustain their operations until the conflict's conclusion. Boeing would persist in its construction of aerial bombardment aircraft. Kaiser would continue to commission naval vessels. Ford would maintain its output of utility vehicles. The production lines would maintain their relentless pace. The laborers would continue their essential tasks of joining metal through welding, riveting, and overall assembly. And the instruments of war would continue to be distributed to every front of the global struggle. By the month of May in the year of our Lord, 1945, the moment of Germany's capitulation, American manufacturing facilities had generated a sufficient quantity of armaments to provision not only the American military, but also substantial segments of the British, Soviet, and other Allied fighting forces. By the month of August in the year of our Lord 1945, the moment of Japan's surrender, American shipbuilding yards had constructed a sufficient number of seafaring craft to establish dominance over every oceanic expanse on the planet. The responses of the Allied leaders upon their initial observation of this immense output were by no means hyperbolic. If anything, they were perhaps a touch reserved. What they were privy to was the very bedrock of industrial might that underpinned the Allied triumph. What they grasped was that the ultimate result of the conflict was no longer subject to uncertainty. What they expressed, through their varied pronouncements, was a fundamental verity. The capacity of the United States to produce war material was the determining factor in the Second World War. The leaders of the Allied nations grasped this reality from the very instant they witnessed it firsthand.